York Times Foreign Affairs op-ed columnist in 1995. He joined the paper in 1981, when he served as the Beirut bureau chief in 82, Jerusalem bureau chief in 84, and then in DC as the diplomatic correspondent in 89, and later White House correspondent and economic correspondent. Mr. Friedman was awarded the 1983 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting from Lebanon, and from the 1988 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting from Israel. He also won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for commentary. He's the author of many, many books, including From Beirut to Jerusalem, and also Hot, Flat, and Crowded, an international bestseller as well. We are honored to have Thomas Friedman with us. And Ambassador Dennis Ross is the counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy prior to returning to the Institute in 2011. He served 2 years as the Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, and a year as Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. For more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in Middle East peace process and dealing directly with the parties in negotiations. A highly skilled diplomat, Ambassador Ross was U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. He was instrumental in assisting Israelis and Palestinians to reach the 1995 interim agreement. He also successfully brokered the 1997 Hebron Accord, facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, and intensively worked to bring Israel and Syria together. Ross is the author of several influential books on the peace process, the Middle East, and international relations. His most recent book, co-written with his Washington Institute colleague David Malkowski, is Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. And with that now, gentlemen, I will turn it over to you. And once again, we are so honored to have you with us today.
All right, well, thank you, Gil. As you noted, Tom and I do this every Yom Kippur, and while we're not thrilled about the circumstances, we're really happy to do this and not be fasting at the same time. I want to say one thing before we start. I want to thank you, Gil. What you've been doing in terms of your meditation sessions on Friday, the Kabbalah Shabbats, and the Shabbat services have been remarkably, I think, moving and meaningful. They remind us of the role of spirituality at a time like this. You offer us both instruction from the tests and lessons for today. And I think Tom and I approach what we're doing today very much in the spirit of what you've been doing leading the shul. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Tom's going to start, and then I will follow Tom. And we, as you mentioned, there's the chat function in Zoom, and we'll be looking at the chats. And so the chat will produce questions to us. And then once we both finish speaking, we'll try to address the questions. So Tom, why don't you go ahead?
Well, Dennis, thank you. It's so great to be here with you and Gil, and I echo everything Dennis said about our great leader. I'm new to everybody else, Gil, or if you are not a Kol Shalom member and you're listening, Bruchim Habayim, great to have you. And if you like what you hear today, follow up with Deb. We have a wonderful shul and community, and if you're so moved, you can even click the donate button on our website. So Danny, the way I would start, Gil, I'm so glad you referenced the book I wrote in 2008 called Hot, Flat, and Crowded, which was about the natural world. And that book and the people I interviewed for that book and became friends of mine as a result of that book has done me in such good stead now in trying to understand and explain what we're going through. So let me start at kind of 30,000 feet and give you maybe a macro view from the perspective of Mother Nature. And then I'll let Danny do some of the policy implications when we'll open it up for questions. So I think we have to start with where this pandemic came from, but not only where this pandemic came from, why are we suddenly living in an age of SARS and MERS and H1N1? Why are we just getting Ebola, just getting one after another? And the reason is that we have been abusing the natural world. We have been abusing Mother Nature's patrimony. What we've been doing is through unremitting development and deforestation and emissions of CO2. What we've been doing is actually weakening Mother Nature's immune system. In this particular case, what we've been doing through development, urbanization, and deforestation, and hunting is all over the world. We have been in different ecosystems. We've been killing the apex predators and the most iconic species. Once those predators have been removed, we're leaving behind the generalized species, particularly rats and bats and primates, who can live in damaged environments and thrive once we've killed off their predators. Now, these generalized species carry 75% of the zoonotic diseases, the viruses, that have actually been threatening us. They co-evolve with these viruses in their natural habitats. When we disrupt those habitats, kill off their predators, and then bring our cities closer to them, and then even worse, actually hunt some of these generalized species and sell them in wet markets right next to domesticated meat, we create the context for these zoonotic diseases that jump from wild animals to human beings. That's where SARS came from. That's where we believe MERS came from. That's why we're getting these rapidly accelerating airborne pathogens that are becoming epidemics, and in this case, a pandemic. We need to get back in harmony with nature. What's worse is that we have not only upset our balance with nature, but we've also upset our balance with each other. So not only are we more vulnerable because of what we're doing to abuse nature, we're more vulnerable because of how we are out of balance with ourselves. In particular, we have a president now who injects partisan venom into the mainstream of our body politic, and that is making us less immune as well. We suffer now from an immunity to just really bad ideas that now circulate in our societies. So we're vulnerable politically, and we're vulnerable to nature. So Trump has said, we're at war with this pathogen. And war is an interesting metaphor here, but it can be enormously misleading when your enemy is nature. You see, when we fought the Nazis and the Japanese, we could out-mobilize them, we could out-strategize them, we could even out-manufacture them, airplanes and tanks. When we fought the Soviet Union, we could out-innovate them, and we could outspend them, and we could win the Cold War. But when your enemy is nature, Mother Nature is a very different kind of foe. Because Mother Nature is just chemistry, biology, and physics. That's all she is. You cannot talk her up, you can't talk her down, you can't say, Mother Nature, we're having a bad recession. Could you take a few weeks off? Or Mother Nature, I'm tired of sheltering at home, I'm going to the tattoo parlor. Because Mother Nature, she will actually do and only do whatever chemistry, biology, and physics dictate. And she always bats last. And she always bats 1,000. Do not mess with Mother Nature. So that is what we're doing. When you therefore go to war with her, the only way you can win that war is by adopting 3 strategies. The first is incredible humility and understanding you're up against the most powerful force on the planet. And she is just chemistry, biology, and physics. Secondly, you have to be incredibly coordinated in how you respond. You cannot have one community going off this way, another community going off that way. And thirdly, you need to be all about chemistry, biology, and physics. Because if you're not totally scientifically driven, and she is, if you disrespect her for a second, she will either kill you or someone you love. Now, where Trump completely got off the rails early on was, I always like to say the 2 most powerful forces on the planet are the market and Mother Nature and Father Greed. Trump knows nothing about the natural world. He was obsessed with the market. So the reason he was so slow to respond was whenever he took a step and the market went up, he thought he was winning against Mother Nature. And you'll recall one day after his nationwide speech when the market collapsed, and then he took some other steps the next day and the market soared 2,000 points to a record high. Trump actually took a screenshot of that market rise and he printed it out and autographed it to Lou Dobbs, who showed it, that knucklehead, on his Fox Business show that evening. Do you know what Mother Nature thought about that? Would she watch that and she was howling in laughter because she knew that while Trump was autographing that market rise, she was invisibly, inexorably, exponentially, and mercilessly spreading COVID-19 through the air across our country. Because Mother Nature doesn't start her day at 9:30. She doesn't close at 4, and she doesn't take Saturday and Sunday off. So if you aren't all about humility, coordination, and science, chemistry, biology, and physics, you stand no chance against her. Now and I'll stop with this point to hand it over to Denny. It's a good transition. Let's look at the range of ways people have been trying to fight this war, okay? One strategy was the British strategy originally, Boris Johnson. And he suggested they were going to go for herd immunity. When you have a virus, there's only one way to become immune to it, either through a vaccine or through enough of your people getting the virus, developing immunity to it, so it runs out of hosts. And Boris Johnson said, let's go for herd immunity. He did it in a very crude way, freaked out everybody because all these studies came out that said, well, if this many Brits get it, this is the denominator, and the numerator is the number of people who will die from it. A couple million will die from it, and they all freaked out, and they backed away from that and opted for a mitigation and suppression strategy. And that kind of discredited the herd immunity approach. The second approach is one of mitigation by social distancing and sheltering in place, and then radically intrusive tracing, testing, tracking, and sequestering people with the disease. And that approach was adopted by China, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Germany, Denmark, with varying degrees of impressive success. It was done just incredibly coordinated, rigorously scientific, and with really efficient follow-up. I'd actually add Israel into that group, and the Israelis actually mobilized special forces and their intelligence apparatus to do tracing, tracking, testing, and sequestering. And it's had an effect. They've been able to, in many cases, reopen parts of their economy. That's all good news. But you always have to remember, this is not like Ebola. This is an airborne pathogen. And what's really freaky about it is that it is asymptomatic in many people, evidently. And when you have an airborne pathogen that is asymptomatic, and you do opt for this suppression strategy, you always have to remember, it's still out there. It's still out there. The third approach is Sweden. Sweden is what I would call more coordinated herd immunity, where, but it wasn't as coordinated as it could have been or should have been. The Swedes basically said, hey, we're going to keep our restaurants open. We're going to let our population get the disease, because all indications are, going back to the Diamond Princess ship to what we're seeing elsewhere, is that the vast majority of people who get this disease experience it in mild form or asymptomatically and can easily recover. And the number who require hospitalization are less than the number of hospital beds they need. That's was the Swedish approach. It was actually the approach advocated by Amnon Shashua in Israel for Israel. But the Swedes did not do a good job of protecting their most elderly. So they had a lot of nursing home deaths. And their death statistics are much higher, for instance, than Denmark next door. But at the same time, the Swedish approach to, they believe about 25% of Stockholm now has herd immunity. And I'll say one more thing about that in a second. And the Swedish model is still out there. They're perfecting it now, and I'm watching that very closely. Now, you will have read yesterday, the WHO said, we still don't know that if you acquire this disease, if you have COVID-19, that you will be immune from getting it again. We don't know. Why the WHO decided to issue that now, I have no idea, because if we have no immunity from this after getting it once, then frankly, you can stick your head between your legs and kiss your ass goodbye, because there will be no economy, okay? We're all dead. Just go have fun, folks, because there will be no economy if we all are just gonna keep getting this and getting this. That's not a reason for the WHO not to tell us that if that's the case, but the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And there's been 2 primate studies in China where they have injected COVID-19 into monkeys and then the antibodies, and they proved to be immune. So we just don't know, but I was really surprised they did that. I think it's because they've fallen behind and they've been blamed early on, and they may be kind of covering themselves. They may be right, in which case I said, kiss your ass goodbye. But let us hope that they are wrong. The last approach I would call Georgia. And Georgia is, don't be humble about nature, don't be coordinated, and don't be scientific, and just say, we're gonna go back to work. I would really worry about that approach. That is not respecting nature. And as I said when I began, when you don't respect her, she will kill you or someone you love. By the way, I can ruin any dinner party, and I'm free for weddings and bar mitzvahs. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. As Tom and I have often said, we do weddings and bar mitzvahs, so just sign us up, especially these days. With Zoom, almost anything's possible, and as right now we have 326 different computer screens tuning in, so it's clear there's a high interest. Let me start by first saying knucklehead is actually a diplomatic term that we frequently use when I'm out negotiating, so don't be surprised by that. Secondly, look, having been a political appointee for 2 Republican presidents and 2 Democratic presidents, having served in 3 different White Houses, I wanted to start by saying, what would any of the administrations that I served in, any of the White Houses I served in, whether Republican or Democrat, what would they have done? How would they be approaching this? And I can tell you, whether it was Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, they would have all immediately realized the only way to deal with this, to use the term that Tom did, was through a coordinated approach. They would have immediately focused on, how do we mobilize the international community so we create a coordinated response, a coherent response, a response that is driven by establishing a common approach, create common standards, create common practices, create clearinghouses for how to do things medically, create a macroeconomic approach. And it's not too late to do that, although I don't think it's in the DNA of the current administration, but it still is essential. And part of the reason it's essential also gets to a point that Tom was raising, which is this is still out there. Until we have a vaccine, it's still out there. Like Tom said, I think on the WHO, some of our members of the shul who work at NIH were kind of flabbergasted by that, because they said then it would not be like any other virus. And in fact, this is. It has its antecedents before. So I think it was an irresponsible statement by the WHO. But that again is an indication that there's nobody coordinating anything. This is kind of a free-for-all internationally. And there needs to be coordination because there's going to be a second wave. We have a very large number of countries, still mostly in the Southern Hemisphere, that have not had serious outbreaks of it yet. Most of them are poor, which means they don't have the medical means, the technical means, the financial means to deal with it. As long as this can spread airborne, as long as, in fact, you don't quarantine and close off major parts of the international community, we're still going to be susceptible to this until we have a vaccine. So there is a need to basically do what all other administrations would have done, which is immediately to organize first our allies, to create probably a mechanism like the G20, which also includes the Chinese, the Russians, the Saudis, basically countries from every continent. Then you would have established what is a common approach we're going to take across the board on medical, financial, macroeconomics, travel. All of these things should have been coordinated. We're not even coordinating within the United States, much less the world. And given the reality of how this is not going to go away, and for us to have herd immunity in the United States, at least 60% of the population has to be immune. So we're very far from anything like that. And the absence of coordination is going to continue to haunt us. That's the first observation I wanted to make. The second observation relates more to what's going on, what's going on in the Middle East, but also what we can expect. You take a country like Iran, and Iran is basically, its approach is being dominated by the Revolutionary Guard. On the inside, their real approach is to deny the scope of what is really happening. And by allowing the people to go back to work, their real approach for mitigation is allowing the population to die. It's a different way of achieving herd immunity, the way Tom was describing it, at a high public cost, but that's never been the concern of the Iranian regime. The irony is, at a time when they're squeezed because of sanctions economically, and they're becoming worse off because whatever oil they have that they can sell, which is not a huge amount, it's down to about 100,000 barrels a day because there also is no demand, there's also no price they can get for it. So they're struggling on the inside, and at the same time they're struggling on the inside, they have become even more aggressive on the outside. This past week, they had swarms of small boats go around our naval vessels in the Persian Gulf, a couple coming within 10 yards of our ships, training the guns on their surfaces against our forces. Entirely provocative behavior that could have triggered something. At the same time, Saudi Arabia declared a unilateral ceasefire in Yemen, and the Houthis not only didn't respond, they increased the effort, increased what they're doing militarily, which is again fed by the Iranians. The Israelis, even in the last 2 weeks, have had to carry out attacks into Syria against Iranian targets, primarily Iranian targets, where the Iranians are still putting a major emphasis on what I call the precision guidance project. There are about 130,000 rockets that Hezbollah has, but they don't have terminal guidance. There are rockets they have provided to Syria. What the Iranians are now trying to do is fabricate and manufacture the parts that would allow them to give terminal guidance to all these rockets. And the Israelis understand that this is not an abstract threat, it's a fundamental strategic threat. And so they're feeling the need to continue to act against it because the Iranians aren't slowing down. So regardless of what's going on the inside, the Iranians are just as active, if not more so, on the outside, and they're going to have more fertile ground to play on. And I say that because you're going to have severe stresses in a number of Arab states. Egypt is a country where 50% earns $2 a day and has almost no safety net, can provide almost no safety net. Jordan also has almost no safety net. In the past, when Egypt and Jordan faced real economic difficulties that could produce political instability, they always had the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Kuwaitis to provide an infusion of cash to their central banks to immediately fund projects, to give them grants. They won't have that this time because of the collapse of oil prices. The Saudis and even the Emiratis are actually struggling with their own circumstances. You think about the absence of their ability to provide sort of cash infusions to states like Egypt, a country of 100 million, Jordan, whose security is not only important to Israel, but to all the Gulf states because it's a buffer, we're going to look at the potential for much greater upheaval within a few months. And the Iranians will try to, I think, exploit that upheaval. Again, if you had a coordinated international response that would be anticipating where do we have to help countries, not only because they haven't experienced the breakouts yet, but also because their instability or insecurity sooner or later will affect our own. That would be something that we would be doing. It is not happening at all right now. Maybe by early next year, we'll have a different administration that will understand in its DNA that's how you operate, because America first turns out to make us America vulnerable. Now, one more thing on Israel, and then I'll stop and we'll look at the questions that you're posing on chat. Israel has as Tom said, Israel has probably been as effective as anybody in terms of what it's done. It has effectively shut down the ability through social distancing and shutting down the economy to produce basically, or put itself in a position where it is suffering from a relatively small number of cases. It has 200 deaths, which is for Israel is never insignificant, but still in terms of the overall size of the population, which is now over 9 million, again, you can see it's doing a good job. It is itself debating how to restore the economy in phases. It is a kind of hybrid model like now, which is close to, I would say, Model 2 that Tom outlined. They are talking about, they opened all non-malls yesterday. They're opening up businesses, but many of the businesses like here are operating on the basis of they're allowing those people who are under 50 to come back to work, and those who are older, they're having them work in through Zoom and other such, and through distance working. They will have a government. There is now a government agreement. That government agreement has produced probably the most cumbersome government ever, in the sense that it will have 36 ministers and another 16 deputy ministers. This was because Netanyahu basically wanted to give everybody a job who's within the right-wing bloc. But it is a government that combines Netanyahu and Likud, the right-wing bloc, with blue-white. Blue-white split after Gantz made the decision to come in. I think Gantz made the decision to come in for all the right reasons. You have a national emergency, put the government first. We don't need a fourth election. But he was negotiating with Bibi Netanyahu, and he probably shouldn't have signed off until everything was understood. I want to make 2 points, and then we'll turn it over to your questions. I'll make 3 points, actually. The first is that there are challenges in the Supreme Court over this agreement because there are elements of the agreement that basically really limits anything that Knesset can do. When you have 52 people who are ministers and deputy ministers, and they're also all members of the Knesset, and the agreement that they have forged is no legislation goes forward except that which is controlled, that is agreed to by the two heads, meaning Netanyahu and Gantz. That means almost half of the Knesset controls all the legislation. That will be challenged in the Supreme Court. We'll see if that particular provision survives. I doubt that the Supreme Court will try to somehow rule that the overall agreement is not lawful or legal, because it would guarantee a fourth election. But we'll see what happens. The second point I want to make is that this is a government that has agreed that there'll be no legislation on anything unrelated to fighting Corona and recovering from it for 6 months, except for one area. Third point, that happens to be annexation. Bibi very much wants to go ahead with unilateral annexation based upon the Trump peace plan. Gantz resisted that. In the end, the agreement is they will not proceed with unilateral annexation unless the Trump administration agrees. There also has to be discussion on the effect on regional peace treaties, meaning with Egypt and Jordan. There also has to be discussion of the security situation and international consultation. Those last three items I mentioned are not conditions. Only agreement with the Trump administration is a condition. They could affect Bibi's calculus, but I'll conclude by saying I believe that Bibi wants to go ahead with this because he sees a unique moment to do it. Right now, his legacy is that he's the only sitting prime minister who's ever been indicted. I think he wants to counteract that legacy with a legacy of he's the one who annexed to Israel certain territories like the Jordan Valley that are critical to Israel's long-term security. Whether he in the end goes ahead with it, we will see, but that is clearly his inclination. Okay, we're going to stop there, and now we'll begin to take questions. There's a question, Tom, I'll let you start with. Do you think that COVID-19 will make international organizations stronger or weaker?
Well, I would say, Denny, in answer to that question, that really depends on America, because all the meaningful international organizations, the WTO, the WHO, the UN, they're only as strong as their member states, and they're only as strong as their strongest member state, and that's really the United States of America. You know, historically, in crises like these, America has done three things. It has led the global coalition to combat the crisis, whether it was Nazism or Ebola. So it led the coordination. It set an example by giving aid and succor to others. And third, it was a source of the best scientific or geopolitical analyses. So we led, we gave succor, and we're a source of wisdom to others. This is the first crisis in our lifetime where we have not led, we've pulled up the drawbridge, we have not given succor, and the president's daily briefing has actually become a giant global health hazard. So I could not describe a worse performance of American leadership. And I say this with no jingoistic intent. We are the world. There's not like a world organization that is strong without us. So either we are involved or we aren't. And if we're not, there really is no global response.
Okay, I got a couple questions that I will take. One is a question on, are all the right-wing parties likely to join the Israeli government? At this point, the answer I still think is yes. What you see is Bennett is negotiating with Netanyahu. Netanyahu wants, I think, to preserve the right-wing bloc in toto, but we'll see. That's not final yet, but there is a negotiation that is going on. Actually, I'll swing this one back to you, Tom. Why do you think that we haven't adopted an approach of smart opening up similar to Sweden, or on the order of what David Dr. Katz has promoted, something that you've written about, Tom?
Well, you know, here I want to be very humble. I'm not an epidemiologist. I've just tried to learn as much as I can, talk to them and blend it with other things I've learned. And I wrote this morning about a proposal Graham Allison from Harvard put out. Graham's a brilliant geopolitical historian. And Graham said, and I think this is my way of answer, that in every other great geostrategic crisis we've faced, one of the things that the CIA has done has always adopted a Team B approach. So there would be the formal government response for how do we deal with the Soviet Union? How do we assess its strength? Or in this case, you know, how do we combat this virus? And then the CIA would actually organize a Team B of completely independent public health experts, computer scientists, data experts, economists, a completely independent group whose job would be to radically deconstruct Team A's approach and really challenge it. And maybe then you come up with a synthesis. But because this administration is so poorly led, that concept hasn't been there. And this was Graham's point, that just as wars are too important to be left to generals, maybe pandemics are too important to be left only to the epidemiologists, and that you need a wider perspective, because what we're looking for here is total harm minimization. We want to minimize the lives lost and damaged by the COVID-19, but we have to minimize the damage to the economy, because there will be so many millions more who could die of deaths of despair and devastation and depression and alcoholism and overdose if their jobs, livelihoods, life savings, and businesses they've built a lifetime to build are destroyed by this. And I found the sort of general debate around this appalling, that this has become a left-right issue. And each side starkly characterizes the other. You just want to kill grandma to save your 401k. And you, you know, couldn't care less about economics. You know, you're off on some moral preening kick, you know, to save every life from a pandemic, which is not possible. So both sides have caricaturized each other. And we desperately need a kind of sane Team B approach. But again, it's part of our loss of immunity to our body politic. My friend Marina Gorbis, who runs the Institute of the Future, talks about our cognitive immunity. We've actually lost our cognitive immunity. We've lost our cognitive immunity because we have a president who labels anything he doesn't like fake news and actually peddles from the White House podium crazy shit around different, you know, medical things that he read on the back of a matchbook, okay? So we lose our cognitive immunity that way. We lose our cognitive immunity when we have a network that amplifies everything the president says and peddles also unproven medical ideas. And we lose our cognitive immunity when we become so partisanized and polarized that we can't come together as a body politic and choose the most reasonable, sensible course. So we've not only lost our physical immunity, we've been losing our cognitive immunity. And that is just so dangerous when you're up against Mother Nature, because she's just 24/7, 365, chemistry, biology, and physics.
Okay, so there's 3 questions, 2 of which I will go through quickly and 1 which I'll take a little longer. One question was on, within Israel, will the indictment process go forward? The answer is yes. Gantz, as part of the agreement, Blue-White has the Justice Ministry. Bibi has a court date where when the court convenes and he has to go to trial on May 24th, he has to appear that day. All subsequent dates, he doesn't have to appear. His lawyers will, in all likelihood, plead for a continuance, and it will definitely be several months. So I don't expect the trial to begin in earnest for anywhere from 4 to 6 months. But he will go to trial. That won't be stopped unless the Supreme Court voids the agreement. There's a 4th election, and then he would clearly try to get an immunity agreement if we were to get a majority. Okay, so that's that. Will Azar be fired? You know, I lack the humility I probably should have when it comes to the Middle East, but when it comes to predicting Donald Trump, I'm extremely humble. But on this one, I'll say, yes, I expect him to be fired at some point, just because Trump will be looking for others to blame, aside from China. There's a question, interesting question, and I'm going to read it. Ambassador Dermer, Israel's ambassador to the United States, suggested recently that the Trump plan is the only peace plan that has been viable, providing a boost to Trump among American Jews. First, I'm surprised to have heard this point of view. Second, how are American Jews seeing the current situation in Israel? I would say, I think Ron Dermer is a very smart guy, but I think in this case, the plan isn't viable. The plan will guarantee a one-state outcome because no Palestinians will be able to support a plan that in the end presents a map that ensures that no one could stand up and say that looks like a state. I was sitting with a senior Arab official from a country who was actually interested in finding a way for them to at least say that the plan was serious. And we looked at the map together, and he just shook his head and he said, you know, first of all, they never briefed us on it. Crazy. But secondly, he said, nobody can look at that and say it looks like a state. It would not have been hard to present a plan that actually would have looked like a state. When you're a broker, you hear the term honest broker, which is basically an illusion. No one's ever an honest broker in a negotiation or mediation. Because especially for the United States, we have a stake. That's why we're involved in doing it. You don't have to be an honest broker. You have to be an effective broker. And that means you have to take account of the needs of both sides, not of just one side. At one point, the administration reached out to me a lot over the years, and I can say that they certainly gave me a platform, and I suggested how and what they might do. Unfortunately, they didn't seem to take any of my advice. And at one point, they said to me that we know the Israelis won't like some of this. They'll like some of it, not like some of it. The Palestinians won't like some of it and will like some of it. And I said to them, that's good. That's the way it has to be. But it can't be that one side likes 85% and the other side likes 15% and the other side likes 15% and doesn't like 85%. And I didn't know they would come with a plan that is one side liking 95% and not 5%, and the other side seeing about 5% of what might appeal to them. I don't think that the plan has given Trump a boost among American Jews outside the Orthodox community. You know, I think about between 75 and 80% of the Jewish community will vote Democratic, but not on the Israel issue, but on American issues. And I don't think the Trump plan is viewed overwhelmingly in such a positive way outside, I said, of those who have who basically look at the conflict as one that is a morality play where one side is all right and the other is all wrong. Now, other questions that I will look at. Tom, I'll let you handle this one. In light of the fact that Trump does not want to fund the Postal Service, do you see that as further inhibiting the possibility of voting by mail?
Interesting question. Well, Trump doesn't want to fund the Postal Service because he wants them to raise their rates because that would hurt Amazon.com, which owns the Washington Post. So that's what that's all about. It has like nothing to do with the Postal Service. That said, I think the question is a very important one. And if I were Democrats right now, I'd be locking this in stone right now, making sure that we have in place all the mechanisms for voting if nothing changed about our condition regarding COVID-19 from where we are now to November. They have to have a worst case scenario for voting by mail for whatever is needed to ensure a free and fair election, because I believe there's one thing we have learned about Donald Trump. He has no bottom. Just when you think he's hit bottom, he will go lower. And he will, I have absolutely no doubt, do anything he can if he sees himself headed for loss in this election to delay or discredit whatever vote happens in November. And I think Democrats need to be working on that right now with Republicans to the extent that they can find any, to ensure we have an election in November, that it is free and fair, but it may have to take place under extremely stressful conditions. I would not trust Trump for a moment. He has never once surprised us on the upside.
I have a question that now that Trump has stated he wants the Navy to shoot down, sink Iranian vessels, do you anticipate Iran to back down or to attempt to get the U.S. to fire on one of its vessels? I think in the near term, we won't see more provocative acts like that, but a little bit of time go by. They're not stopping what they're doing in terms of aggressive behaviors, as I was saying before, including, by the way, in Iraq, where I think one of the things they want to produce is increased pressure on us to force us out of Iraq. You know, there could also be a certain moment where they might not mind a limited military exchange. I don't think that, look, the Supreme Leader has always been keen on having others fight us. That's why they created all these Shia militias. They're very good at fighting to the last of the Shia militias. They're not keen on doing it themselves. The Revolutionary Guard is a little different. Revolutionary Guard back during the Iran-Iraq War constantly provoked us and actually fired us. And it's clear that they were sometimes acting without any direction from Tehran. I suspect that won't be the case right now, but I also think they might not, given the fact that there's such a loss of any public belief in the regime in Iran, they might not be so worried about a very limited exchange with us on the grounds that that might provoke a kind of nationalist reaction in their favor. I wouldn't discount that. I just don't think we're going to see it in the near term. I still think the Supreme Leader kind of operates on the basis of not inviting military attacks directly against Iran. And I still think, I would expect that that would still be what guides him, at least in the near term. But I will say this, I fully expect that Iran will try to do something to embarrass Trump before the election. Khamenei was around during the time of Jimmy Carter. He saw what they did to embarrass Jimmy Carter. Carter lost to Reagan. They probably exaggerate in their own minds the role they played in that. And I fully expect that they will look for an opportunity to embarrass Trump before the election.
Danny, let me say one add to your Iran analysis, if I could, because I think that there are some big tectonic geopolitical plates that are moving in the world today under the mask of the COVID-19. And one involves Iran and one involves Saudi Arabia, in my view. So you'll recall last winter, last January, we assassinated Soleimani, Iran's basically top geostrategist. Anne and I and our girls were in New Zealand when that happened. And my editors called me in New Zealand. I was on vacation, and they said, you have to write a column about that. And I said, guys, like, I'm in New Zealand, you know, I'm so far away from this. I need to think about it, you know. And I went to bed that night, and I got up that morning, and I took out my laptop. And I have no idea where this lead of my column came from, or it took me a while to figure it out. And I decided to write a column about the assassination of Soleimani. And it began with the following sentence: the United States just killed the dumbest man in Iran. Now, why did I say that? Because if you actually look, and Dennis has really laid this out, at the needs, desires, and aspirations of the Iranian people today, and then you look at what Soleimani was doing with that country's resources, basically creating weak states, failed states all around it, and spending its money to hire Arab Shiites to kill Arab Sunnis. I can't think of anything that was weakening Iran's immune system as a society and economy more than what Soleimani was doing. He was the dumbest man in Iran. He was looking for dignity in all the wrong places, in all the wrong ways. And as a result of what he was doing, Iran went into this COVID-19 crisis even weaker than it would have otherwise have been. And so in the end, and I totally agree with everything Denny said, I think we really have to be aware of that. But Iran is a weakening state, and its immune system has been self-compromised by a crazy strategy that it's on. And by the way, there are a lot of people in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq who blame Iran, which was the first outbreak hotspot in the Middle East of COVID-19, for spreading it to them, okay? So I'm sure they have all kinds of plans. They've learned little, but I believe in the end, the laws of gravity will apply. Soleimani was the dumbest man in Iran because his strategy was weakening their immune system. And now look what's happened. They can pump maybe sell maybe 150,000 barrels of oil a day, and that's all they've got. That's all they've got to sell. Now you may have noticed, and this is the segue to Saudi Arabia, that the price of oil collapsed. We saw a day last week where you would have to pay someone $31 to take your oil. Let me repeat that. There was so much oil out there that was being pumped that in America, if you pumped a barrel of oil, the only way you could get rid of it was by paying someone $31 to take your pumped oil and store it somewhere on a ship or in an oil drum. So why is that happening? And how does that relate to Iran? Well, that's about another giant geopolitical shift. So for 50 years, Saudi Arabia took the view that it could be the global swing producer of oil. Why? Because Saudi Arabia had 260 billion barrels of oil in the ground, and Saudi Arabia viewed its oil in the ground as money in the bank. And so if the world needed, if OPEC needed them to pump a little more, pump a little less, to keep the price where it was or to affect some geopolitical situation, Saudi Arabia was always the swing producer. I believe we are in the middle of a giant tectonic shift where Saudi Arabia is realizing that because of climate change and the changing global consensus toward fossil fuels, because of the massive rise of electric vehicles, because of the fact that America today now produces 21% of its electricity from wind, solar, and hydro, and a few other renewables, and because of the global backlash against petroleum-based plastics, their oil in the ground is no longer money in the bank. It may in fact be a stranded asset, and God, I hope it is. Well, if that is the case, then Saudi Arabia is no longer going to be the swing producer. It's going to care about one thing and one thing only: market share. That it sell its oil as a diminishing asset to more people in more places. That's what the fight with Russia was really about. And as many of us predicted when Trump said, I worked out a deal between the two of them about the dumbest thing we could do, that it wouldn't last. And of course, the price of oil collapsed, right after that. What we should be doing, and this is a giant new strategic opportunity for us, is becoming what my friend Andy Karsner, Bush's Assistant Secretary of Energy for Renewables, says, the swing consumer. We should now become the swing consumer. We should ban all imports of oil from Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. We should set a price domestically of $40 to $45 a barrel for our domestic produced oil to keep our own oil industry from totally collapsing, which would collapse a whole bunch of banks, but would keep the price high enough so natural gas prices wouldn't fall and undercut solar and wind, and so gasoline prices wouldn't fall and undercut the electric car. We have an incredible strategic opportunity here to become the swing producer and undermine every one of these petro dictatorships, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Have a nice day.
I'm sure they will have a nice day under those circumstances. I would note what's quite interesting, in the midst of all this, Saudi Arabia has done a couple of very interesting things that may well suggest continuing to have to try to change their image. One is they have ended the practice of flogging, again, in keeping with the kind of thing that MBS was doing to change society. Secondly,
You know that, Dan, it's interesting.
on top of that, they are showing, and in the Muslim world during Ramadan, you're fasting from dawn to dusk. And so what do you do during the time of fasting? And especially now when you can't go out and pray because of the restrictions, you stay home and you watch TV. In Saudi Arabia, they're running a show that they prepared that shows the history of Jews in the Gulf in a favorable light, which is, again, an indication that they get something bigger is going on and they're going to have to find a way to adjust. Just two little interesting tidbits to throw in there. One last little tidbit. Iraq has its border closed now with Iran because Iraq is also blaming the Iranians for what's happening in terms of COVID. They're under enormous pressure from the Iranians to open up because they're the one kind of outlet for the Iranian economy right now. They sell about $20 billion worth of goods to the Iraqis, and the Iraqis are resisting the pressure in that regard. One question I got on how can Bibi take up annexation if nothing can come before the Knesset in the next 6 months that is not corona related? Because there's one exception to that provision, and it's written into the agreement that on July 1, Bibi can raise the issue of annexation. Here's a post-US election. Do we foresee one America or two, and will there be a continuing resistance along red-blue lines? Is this sustainable in the long term? Will the USA be able to endure these ongoing tensions as one nation? Let me start and I'll turn it over to Tom. First, if this isn't a wake-up call, what can be? You know, maybe we'll continue along these lines because the threats to identity and the fears that exist in part of the country are such that the Trump brand of populism has taken root there. But a lot will depend upon the outcome of the election. If this election, it turns out that the Trump brand is rejected, and not by a narrow margin, but by a large margin, then it becomes a lot easier. I do think those in the Republicans in the Congress who have not been willing to be critical, who've gone along, would, I think, learn the lesson if the election's not a close one, meaning if Trump loses and he loses big. If the election ends up being close, but he loses, then I'm afraid we're going to continue to see the kind of polarization we still have. Although, as I said, I do think the longer that COVID goes on, the more you see that there's a need for responsible behavior. There are a number of Republican governors, look at the Republican governor of Ohio, who has been very responsible. So maybe the basis for addressing the very concerns you're outlining, maybe we'll find them with a set of Republican governors who've demonstrated, because they have the more immediate responsibility for their state, they've demonstrated that the way to deal with this is with fact, not fiction, science and not fantasy, and learning the best you can. What Tom was citing in terms of this model of, in a sense, come up with, with both public health and economists who can basically create a kind of hybrid model that allows you to proceed the best you can. Clearly, until we have testing, including specifically effective tests on determining who has the antibodies that create immunity, it's going to be very difficult to get back to anything that looks like normalcy. Tom, you want to comment on that one? Or there's a related one I'll let you take a shot at. The pandemic has highlighted societal inequities in a significant way that would seem to clarify how our country is weakened by these inequities. Do you think this experience will lead to fundamental and meaningful change? The two questions I think are related.
Yeah, very, very good questions. I would simply say that what we learned is pandemics tend to accelerate pre-existing trends. They expose pre-existing strengths and weaknesses. So does your society have a strong public health system or not? Does it have high social trust or not? Does it have leadership that is fact-based or science fiction-based or not? It exposes that, and it widens any fractures, and I think we're seeing all of that. So I did a column a couple of weeks ago in which I said that Joe Biden has committed to naming a woman as his vice president. That's great. But I think just as important, he should opt for a national unity government of the general kind that Israel has opted for, that he should look for sane Republicans, Bernie Sanders people, moderate Democrats, conservative Democrats, and bring them all into a governing coalition for two reasons. One is, I believe that today's Republican Party, under Donald Trump, aligned with the evangelicals, is one of the greatest threats to our immune system. It needs to be crushed. It needs to be destroyed, but in an election, it needs to be seen as rejected by the American people. Only then, do I believe, can we have a sane conservative party. We need a healthy conservative party here to balance our politics, to bring more market-oriented solutions to the bear. We do not have a sane conservative party today. We have a deformed, unscientific, non-fact-based religiously driven coalition that is a danger to our immune system. I think the best way to get a sane Republican Party is for a national unity coalition to come together that crushes this party, and out of the ashes, God willing, a sane Republican Party would emerge. I believe a national unity government is important for many reasons other than that, but two in particular. One, we are now all sheltering in place. People are social distancing and playing as nice as they can. And God bless people for doing that. But when we do come out of our bubbles and our shelters and our homes, there is going to be an incredible fight over equity. Who got bailed out and who didn't? You mean Boeing got bailed out after years of spending money to buy their own stock, mismanaging, the 737 MAX. They got bailed out. But my aerospace company, which managed its balance sheet really well, which did its business well, I now have to compete against Boeing with cheap government money. They got bailed out, and my favorite Lebanese restaurant didn't, because they had a government lobbyist who could do it, and I didn't. Folks, you cannot imagine, if this goes on a couple more months and our economy has continued to be crushed, the equity issues. Just look at those pictures of the hundreds and hundreds of cars that lined up in San Antonio to get a single box of food. There are people who are being devastated right now. And the anger that's going to explode after this, if it is dealt with in a partisan way, woe be unto us. And the second huge issue that's going to emerge is going to be around civil liberties. Because just as after 9/11, I wanted to know the person next to me on the plane wasn't carrying a bomb. If I'm going to take a plane again, I'm going to want to know that he or she is not carrying COVID-19. From my point of view, you can have all my health records. You can put a thermometer permanently on my head, and you can put a chip in my DNA. I don't care. But a lot of other people are going to feel differently. And there are going to be huge civil liberty issues around this, debates and arguments until and unless there's a vaccine. And that too, I believe, will require a national unity government. I think Biden is leaning that way just by nature. And I hope he continues and does pursue that kind of approach.
We got a few more minutes, and I'm gonna do like a lightning round of identifying questions and answering very quickly. One is, why did international organizations, like NATO, not help Italy, Spain, Greece during the outbreak in the first phase? Does this signal the world is moving away from a global supply chain model and globalization as a core aspiration? Look, there'll be some rethinking of supply chains, obviously, but I would say the reason that NATO didn't respond is because there was no US leadership. Every major crisis in the past, when the US doesn't lead, you have a vacuum. And there's nobody there to come in and fill that vacuum. And in this case, basically, you had the hoarder's instinct, just like we saw people here go and buy up all the toilet paper. Well, you had countries focused in the same hoarding instinct because there was no leadership. I think if you have leadership again, you can address some of that. If you have a more sane approach to the outside world, you also realize if you go ahead and you disrupt all the global supply chains, everything becomes a whole lot more expensive because it's a whole lot less efficient. Can we comment on the Trump-Putin spirit of the Elba joint statement this week? Yes. Just as soon as the Russians stopped trying to interfere in our election, just as soon as they stopped all their disruptive cyber trolls that are out there trying to spread all sorts of real fake news, then I'll know that comment, that joint statement has some meaning to it. Their behavior hasn't changed one iota, including internally, not surprisingly. Tom, as a follow-up, what can Democrats do to be as certain as possible that Trump will leave office even when he's voted out of office?
I think we can't be. We simply have to be really vigilant right now, putting in place the legal assurances that we will have a free and fair election then. I'm not an expert on that, but we need to be doing everything we can. And making sure that he is alive to the fact that we know what he's going to try to do, and every day be pointing it out or highlighting the threat of it.
Yep. That point I think is especially important. The more people talk about it now, the more you raise the cost to him of doing it, and the more you also put Republicans in a position of how do they defend that. So you can't wait until election day. You have to do it well in advance. If Kim Jong-un is truly out of the picture, how can we expect the relations with North Korea to change, or will they change? First, we don't know if he is. Secondly, I hate to say it, but the military has always been seen in North Korea as being the hardest line of all of those. I wouldn't expect any change anytime soon. The fact that they just did a series of mobile rocket tests suggests that they're sending a message of being as provocative as ever. That usually is a sign that they're feeling more exposed. Other than staying home, what can we do in our participant democracy to improve our government response to the pandemic? Tom, you want a shot at that one?
What can we do? Well, I'm so lucky I have a column, so I can elevate and expand what I hope are intelligent voices. Individually, I think what we can do is find any way possible to reward good leadership. I think Governor Hogan in Maryland, where I live, has been a really good governor. Turns out he is blessed. His wife is from South Korea, and she was talking to her relatives all the time in South Korea about what was going on there, and she got him to act very early, and even managed to use her contacts in South Korea to get 500,000 masks. So I think it's really important that we give a shout out to good leaders, whatever party they're from. That's certainly one thing we can all do.
Who could best help Biden win the election as a VP candidate? For my part, I would say Amy Klobuchar probably helps him more than others. Tom, you have any ideas?
You know, I think Governor Whitmer of Michigan's shown a lot of leadership. Gina Raimondo is a favorite of mine, the governor of Rhode Island. I like Amy Klobuchar, obviously. She's from Minnesota, and all people from Minnesota are good and effective people. So I think he'll have a lot of choices, but I would urge him to go beyond just appointing his vice president. I would name maybe his top 5, key cabinet posts, including Secretary of State Mitt Romney.
I think I'll ask you, Gil, are we at the time limit now, or should?
I think we actually are at the time limit. So
Okay.
I'm gonna wrap it up at this point and just say, express extraordinary gratitude and thanks to both of you gentlemen for once again, a session that is not just informative. It's something that teaches us all and inspires us all to think about how we can act and make a difference, how we can create a world of greater justice and envision a world that is more healed than it currently is. And in that, you are both a great blessing to the Jewish people and to the world in all of the work that you do. Thank you so very much, both of you.